Hello, everyone. We're back. We got to see we got people already waiting in the chat. You don't have to wait any longer. I try to, like I said, we try to get the stream going on time, if not a minute or two behind, especially when you have a guest. But yes, we will get right into it. Yes, we have some. I don't know if we call it big news. We have some introductory news this week from the Angular team, and we wanted to at least continue the conversation while it's still fresh, because I think it's pretty significant. So I'm Brandon Roberts. You see my face before. Alex, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Alex Rickabaugh. I'm the technical lead for the Angular framework team, the core framework team. Um, yeah, here and happy to talk reactivity and signals.
Yes. Reactivity is the topic of the day ever since the tweets that went out, and we've been already had people building stack blitzes and publishing repos probably, and all the other the other cool stuff that has gone on
Yeah, we
around
had
that.
a kind of a bet going on the team on how long it would take Ania to tweet
Mm.
about signals PR. I
Yes.
think it was about 3 minutes. It was
Oh,
pretty
yes.
quick.
3 minutes. I'm going to say that's pretty slow, I must say, as far as
Yeah, I think he
time
can do
goes.
better next time.
I know he tends to lurk around GitHub repos and things, so I thought he would have already had something in place going there. But yeah, thanks. I see we got a good number of people showing up in the chat already. Appreciate y'all for coming out. But yes, we wanted to talk about reactivity and with signals in Angular because, like I said, new is fresh. Um, so yeah, where should we start? Let's see. Maybe what we can do is a little level setting first before we get into because this I intentionally tried to be vague about not vague but couch the term when I sent out the tweets and things talking about this as a journey because we're Angular is on the road to getting signals but we're not quite there yet. So maybe we talk real quickly about uh, the current state of reactivity in Angular with Zone.js if you kind of want to explain those for people who may not be that familiar
Yeah,
with that side of things.
absolutely. So going back to the very first Angular JS versions, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was based around this idea of change detection, and it was kind of a novel idea at the time that you would take, um, that you would be able to just bind state in your application somewhere into templates inside your components, and the framework would just figure it out for you.
Mm-hmm.
That you could update a field in response to an event or in response to a network request or something like that. And the framework would be able to just take that data that you've put into your model and figure out where in the view it needed to update things in order to display that data to the user. And I remember, we all talk about our the magic moment of Angular JS that I think a lot of developers went through when
Mm-hmm.
you had the input with the ng model and you had the like text binding showing the value, and you're typing in the text box and it's just updating automatically when you wrote like no code to make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very magical experience with Angular and Angular JS.
Yeah, I can attest to this firsthand because when I was learning Angular JS, that was like the first experience I had of going on the Angular JS homepage and looking at two-way data binding and actually just changing a field like in the example that was on the homepage and seeing the two-way data binding. I thought that was pretty cool. Of course, I had no idea of the magic that was happening underneath
Yeah.
there even back then. But yeah, it seemed to have progressed from we started with Angular JS and um, I don't I don't guess Zone just had a formal name back then, but
So,
um,
so the way it worked in Angular JS, right, was because the framework was in charge of all of your event listeners.
mm-hmm,
We had the $HTTP service, we had $Q for promises. Kind of the framework wrapped all of the browser APIs, and you never talked to the browser directly. You only talked to Angular JS. And so we kind of knew all of the points at which something could happen in the application, which means we knew all of the places where you might update state, and we're able to run the kind of, digest cycle, I think it was called back then, to resynchronize the UI to the model. So Angular entered the picture, and we were looking at one of the primitives that was in the very new Dart language back then. It was called Dart zones. And Dart had kind of a similar thing going on.
Quite a choice with a name, I must say.
Yes, yeah. And Dart had a very similar thing going on, where it's a compiler of a separate language to JavaScript. And the only API for interacting with the browser really was through the Dart exposed API. So they had their own HTTP API, their own set of promise, they called them futures, but basically a promise. And so it was doing kind of the same thing AngularJS was doing, which was intercepting those calls and being able to tell you through the zone API when something interesting had happened in the browser. And Mishko had this idea that, we can port the Dart concept of zones into JavaScript itself. And instead of kind of at a compiler level intercepting all of the calls to APIs, we do it at runtime. So we monkey patch promise, we monkey patch add event listener, we monkey patch set timeout, an HTTP client, or XHR back then. And through that, we can know basically whenever something interesting happens in the application, and we can use that to drive this digest cycle, or what became the change detection algorithm.
Yeah.
And so this is how reactivity in Angular works today, right? You as a developer writing an Angular component, you don't really think about how your model is changing or how to tell the framework that your model is changing. You bind data in your template from wherever you want to, and whenever the user clicks a button, whenever a set timeout happens, or some browser event happens, Angular steps in afterwards and says, okay, something interesting happened, some part of the application code ran. I need to make sure that the UI is in sync with the model. And so it executes this process of change detection and evaluates all of your bindings to see, does it need to update this text node? Does it need to update the contents of this element, this DOM property?
So what you're saying is Zone.js is two-way data binding for the browser. I know it just makes sense.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
I just thought of that just now. I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding, but yes.
And one of the big differences between what AngularJS did and what Angular chose to do was in AngularJS, you had the digest cycle, and we would run the digest cycle many times. Because in the middle of reacting to one part of your model changing, you could have a dollar watch, right? And you would say, when this property changes, I'm going to go and update some other property. And so it took sometimes multiple passes of this thing before your model stabilized. And we saw that was a clear performance problem for people who ended up with very complicated models in AngularJS. And so we kind of redesigned how that worked with Angular. We introduced this concept of unidirectional data flow, and we did a single change detection pass. So the idea was you would do all of your model synchronization before change detection starts, and then we would start at kind of the root component in your application, check that component, check all of the children, and descend down the tree in one single pass. And then we go back and do it again, and if we detect any discrepancies, right, we throw the famous expression change after it's been checked.
Oh yes, please, no, it's too early. It's too early for change after checked errors.
So fast forward about 7 to 10 years, right? It's been a significant amount of time since Angular 2.0 came out.
Yes, it has. It seems that it doesn't seem like that long. When you all did the talk at NGConf, the 10-year review, I was like, man, it kind of hit me at that time that that much time had passed since AngularJS and the migration to Angular and even that whole thing. So yeah, it's been a journey already.
And it's amazing and a really it's a privilege to be in a position as a web technology where you have 10 years of history. where you've been around for that long and have 10 years of kind of user feedback and bug reports, and you've tried these things and you're able to see how these big decisions play out over time. Because when you sit down and build something like Angular or React or Solid or any other framework, you're not going to get everything right. And even if you do somehow, the web is going to be different 5 years down the road. So the decisions you made 5 years ago are not necessarily still the correct ones today, even if they were back then. And so we've been kind of embarking on this process of looking at Angular through this lens of what worked and what didn't, or what used to work but doesn't anymore. And one of the things we've seen is that this Zone.js story of having kind of what I would call like a magical reactivity system, right? You don't have to wrap your state. You don't have to structure it in any particular way. You don't have to tell the framework when you change it. We just figure it out for you. That is a beautiful experience when you're looking at the one input and the text now. But as you scale up to bigger and bigger applications, as you scale up to more and more developers, as you pile more code on top of this thing, you start to see some cracks in the system. You start to see cases where, hey, I'm trying to do something like form validation, where the validity state of my form depends on the validity state of the individual controls, which is trying to push state in the wrong direction as far as Angular's change detection algorithm is concerned, right? That's information flowing from children to parent, when the unidirectional data flow is telling you, no, information should always flow from parent to child. You see issues with, we see sites that run change detection 1,000 times on page load.
Oh, wow.
And you dig
that
in.
was one thing I was going to ask was, you probably have more context here of, you introduced Zone.js. I can't remember if the ability to opt out of Zone.js came along with that at the time, or if that came later.
I think it was pretty early that we had, ng zone run outside Angular. Then there's questions of like, you run the scroll event in the zone, right? If you just bind the scroll event naively, it will run in the zone because we don't know if you're going to change the model or not. So every little scroll event that fires, you have to check, did you update anything that would be displayed in the UI? So there's problems with that. We like quite often, one thing I see is people load third-party scripts for advertising or marketing or something like that, and they somehow end up initializing it in the Angular zone. And the script sets a timer that fires, or a scroll listener or something, and it's just constantly triggering change detection unnecessarily. So that's one case there. A second interesting case is the lifecycle hooks. So when we're running this change detection algorithm, you have callbacks that run inside of it. So you have ng on init, you have ng on changes, you have ng after view init. An interesting trivia question for everyone is like, what state is it legal to update or not in ng after content init?
ng after content init. Oh wow, that's a good one.
And is it different from ng after view init, right? Which parts of the model are safe to change? I don't know the answer to this.
Oh, I was gonna poll the audience, people in the chat. If you're watching right now, leave a comment and tell which one is safe to update the model in after that particular life cycle hook. So what things are safe to update there. So we'll see what the audience says. But yeah.
But the point I want to make here, right, is that it is a little bit complicated because the zone magic isn't working for you inside the actual change detection process. Right? Zone is not able to say like, hey, you changed the model again, so I need to go and do change detection again. You're inside of change detection. So you better not touch the model in places where we've already looked at it, because nothing is going to go back and look again. So what we've seen is this magic story kind of breaks down, and you have to start really caring about the details of how this works. Both to get good performance out of it, right? To avoid the mistake of running all of your third-party scripts in zones and triggering change detection 1,000 times. But also because just on a day-to-day basis, some of the things you do as a developer fall outside the boundaries of the magic. And you add to that, set timeout, right? As someone just said. It's a great example.
That's where we're going.
we saw a case, interestingly, with an application in Google where they had done set timeout for exactly this reason. They had some reaction they needed to do inside a lifecycle hook. It didn't fit this type of state change that you were allowed to do there, so they did set timeout. That's a fine solution when you have one of these components on a page.
Mm-hmm.
But this application had a data table with 100 of these components in it, which is 100 set timeouts and 100 change detections, right? So this concept of like it's magic, you don't have to think about it, just isn't true at scale.
Mm-hmm.
You really do have to think about how state changes in your application.
They're all set timeout 0, so it's fine. It's not like
But you
they
still do
continue to
a
do it there.
separate
Yeah.
change detection for each one.
Mm-hmm.
So pro tip for the chat, use promise resolve instead of set timeout. It coalesces
Okay.
to a single second change detection.
Okay. That is a good tip to know, because I know I have definitely done that before, where I think when I was working on probably the Angular component router, and I was trying to get the routes from the view, and then if I did it too early, it would give me an error or something. And I was like, I don't want to do it, but I had to slap the set timeout on there, like the water's leaking, and I had to slap the tape on it to keep it moving. So yeah.
And it feels a little bit dirty, right? Like you always put a comment in there, like, I'm sorry, I couldn't make it work the other way.
To do, fix later.
Yeah. So that's kind of how where we ended up where we are today, is retrospectively, like looking at the framework and the way it's used and the way the web has evolved, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of new APIs being added to the browsers. Browser vendors are really in the period of just like creativity, I think, where there's now intersection observers and resize observers and new APIs for interacting with CSS, and all of them kind of, we have to ask ourselves the question, like, should Zone.js patch this? Should it do it automatically, or should it? There's a cost to that, right? There's a code size cost. There's a startup cost.
Yeah, and even if we're talking about like using Angular like on the server, and then you have to bring in Zone.js, and then you're trying to patch all the server APIs. Also, promises mainly used there too. But then it's like another place that you have to, like, Zone could be eating up errors on your. I ran into this myself. So Zone could be eating up promise errors on the server, and it doesn't give you as good of a message if something goes wrong, because it has kind of taken over that control.
Absolutely. And so I want to be fair to Zone.js here, right? Like it powers a pretty fantastic experience. Angular always feels magical to me to use compared to other frameworks, because I spend a lot less time thinking about, like, how do I tell the framework about what I'm doing? You put state in a component, you can move it to a service, you can share it or not. You can use something like NGRX state management or NGXS. The framework really kind of doesn't care how you structure your state, and that is a really powerful thing to be able to do. But we've noticed that just at scale, it just seems to start having some of these more fundamental problems.
I know for the longest, well, I don't know if this is maybe still the case, but I know that for the longest, the team took the approach of you bring your kind of state management, you bring your reactivity like with you, and we'll just handle it because of Zone.js, and we don't have to have an opinion on how the framework gets notified of a change, because we have this internal system that does that. But now with this new introducing signals, or going into the journey of going to signals, there's like you're saying, okay, now we've noticed what happens when we don't necessarily have a strong opinion about it, but now we're going to introduce something to give you more of an opinion there.
And what we've seen is a lot of people who get to this point in their applications, who are architecting kind of bigger Angular apps, do end up reaching for state management and kind of RxJS patterns around, using on push and driving on push by actually telling components, hey, you're dirty, you need to be change detected. Otherwise, don't worry about it, right? It's like just don't bother checking these things. And so you kind of optimize the cost of change detection by restricting the number of components, and building kind of this like finer grained reactivity in via RxJS. And this just didn't seem like the right way this scenario should play out for us. On the one hand, you have, developers who are building with RxJS and architecting their data in a way to be able to tell Angular, like, hey, I'm changing this component. Sometimes even down to I'm changing this binding. And you have Angular, which is using Zone.js, which says, hey, that's great, but I'm going to check the whole world anyway, just because I don't either trust you or pay attention.
That's what I was going to say. Angular Zone.js isn't very it doesn't trust a whole lot of things. It's like that's nice, that's cool, but I'm gonna go check everything anyway because I don't necessarily trust you.
Yeah, and even if you like, okay, I'll check that guy, but I'll check everyone else too because like you didn't tell me you didn't change them, right? And it's really that latter part that where things get really interesting. If we have accurate, perfect information about which components need to be updated. So we've had zoneless on our radar for a while, but it's not so simple as just saying like turn off zones.
Yes.
If you turn off zones, you need some way of driving change detection and figuring out kind of when to check things in addition to what to check.
Yeah, and there have been, of course, there have been strides in the community of if you turn off Zone.js using things like Rx Angular, or even NGRX has NGRX component has APIs that if you want to opt out of zones, it can still kind of notify the system that this particular thing needs to get updated. But all that's still driven by, like I said, primarily driven by RxJS. So, so we had that. We kind of had that state of reactivity in Angular, and now we're moving towards kind of, I'll call it the next phase of reactivity in Angular, which is signals. And you mentioned this in the discussion, but this has not been a quick process that the team has had of trying to get to this point.
It's been about a year that we've been kind of started talking about like, okay, do we want to do zoneless? Do we want to do some kind of different reactivity system in Angular? We did a lot of experimentation. We built prototypes of RxJS based methods, compiler based stuff, like trying, we did experiments on like, what if reactivity was designed into the JavaScript language, just to see how that, how interesting that could be. And across all of those different concepts, signals kept coming back to the surface as this thing that offered kind of the set of trade-offs that we were looking for. So I really think about this as more, we want Angular to have a language of reactivity that templates understand. Right. So when you're coming from whatever state management system you're using, however you're structuring your state, you have a way of speaking to the framework and saying like, I'm changing these particular things. And Angular is able to do its thing and optimize the dirty checking, model to UI synchronization process based on that. It will understand what you're telling it about when and where things are changing, rather than kind of saying, that's great, but I'm going to check the world anyway.
Yeah, I remember when, maybe it was when it got added to the roadmap, or that kind of one of those bullet points. I think, of course, the standalone components was one. And then being able to make Zone.js optional was one. And that was probably, like I said, probably about a year ago, maybe even further than that. But I was like, I wonder, the first question is, I wonder what that's going to be. Because like I said, we've gone down the path of using RxJS as kind of a baseline for reactivity, to notify the system when things are changed. And then they have Zone.js also, which is a piece of that also. But then moving on to signals, we're kind of taking, what do I want to say? We're kind of tackling two things at once, kind of the RxJS side of things and like the Zone.js side of things, where you can still, like you said, still notify the framework of something that's happened without necessarily having to reach for RxJS to be a little more fine-grained with the reactivity.
And I think too, it's more than two things. Like there's as I think Jeremy was saying earlier, we're like tackling 8 problems with this one kind of solution. Um, we're kind of aiming at this problem of like you have to learn deeply how things work to use Angular at scale.
Mm-hmm.
You have to kind of look inside the magic and understand some parts of this puzzle, or use other tools like ArcGIS and state management and on push on top of it to kind of disable the magic and take over some parts of it yourself. I one of the things that I really love about the future plan here is this idea of getting to you have one simple model for how things change in the application.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you need a template to update, if you depend on data, you do that through a signal. The template will change detect when it needs to, when you update that signal. And that should work from anywhere, right? No more like what can you set or not in an ng after view checked hook. Do you need a set timeout or not? It's just you set the signal that tells Angular, hey, this thing's dirty, it needs to update, and the framework does the right thing. And can receive multiple of these messages and optimize things and check in batches and all of that fun stuff.
So, well, I'll take a pause here to if anybody in the audience, I call them audience, in the chat has any questions, feel free to drop those in there. We can't promise we'll answer all of them, but if you have anything that's applicable to the signals conversation, feel free to drop those in there and try to at least get to a few of them if we have time. But yes, you talked about the kind of you tried a bunch of things, you landed on signals. And I do want to give a shout out to Ryan Carniato, who admittedly said he did not invent signals, but he definitely has been the champion.
Oh yeah, he's definitely the prophet of signals.
I would say he does the thing. He hasn't done it himself, but he could do the thing of where other people on Twitter where they put they're the CEO of something in their like Twitter tagline. He's like the CEO of signals. I'm gonna give him that tagline here, but yes, definitely wanted to give him some credit there.
I love that. And yeah, Ryan has actually been, so we've actually been talking to him about this project for a long time, kind of, consulting, and we met in Poland and we met here in the Bay Area. And yeah, he's been super open to sharing his expertise with us. We're really grateful for the effort he's put into helping us go from this space of like starting to think about these problems to really having a firm grasp on all the trade-offs. Has been invaluable.
Yeah, I did have well, like I said, feel free to answer or not answer these questions, but I did have you mentioned lifecycle hooks, but how does signals impact? I'll ask a broad question. Do signals impact lifecycle hooks in that way? Because you mentioned you have these things that kind of let you know when it's safe to do those sort of things, but does signals anyway, do they impact those?
Absolutely, they do. So the main context, I think, we'll probably say for RFC discussions. We're still kind of designing what some of this stuff will look like, but I will use as an example like ng on changes. You do not need ng on changes in a signal world.
Okay.
So part of the beauty of having the framework has a reactive language that it speaks, right? Is we can give you inputs as signals. And if you have an input as a signal and you can use kind of a computed property to say like, oh, I'm going to derive when this input, changes and this input changes, I need to produce a new value for my model. The types of things that people used to do in input setters or used to do in ng on changes get pushed into the reactivity system naturally. So you don't need an imperative lifecycle hook that tells you when your inputs have updated because they're reactive naturally. They're able to tell you that directly, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the oldest and most requested features probably in the GitHub repo was having well, I'm going to say back then it was having lifecycle events as observables and or even event streams in the template as observables. But it seems like in a signals based world, we could see that you could have something that is I don't know. I don't want to call them observables for some reason. I want to make it like
I
a
see
clear.
they're reactive, right?
Yeah.
That like they're able to tell you when they change.
Yeah. Yeah. I think giving them that, because if we say observables, everybody's like, "Oh, great, we're gonna get more RxJS." It's like, no, we're gonna get reactivity, but it's not
So that
necessarily based on RxJS.
there is RxJS interop, right? You
Yeah.
can take a signal and turn it into an observable in probably one line of code.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so if you have signal inputs and you have the ability to turn signals into observables, you can use inputs in observable streams pretty straightforwardly.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. So I know that was mentioned in the GitHub discussion about having the interop there, because I know there would have been probably would have been pitchforks and a bunch of things if there
Yeah.
was not even at least mentioned in there about having that interop there.
Yeah. So this, as we've said, with conversations with you before, and in the like GitHub discussion, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is not about saying, oh, we want to replace RxJS's like raison d'etre and Angular.
Mm-hmm.
Um, RxJS is one of the most powerful tools you can work with for async data. The power of switch map and concat map and combine latest, and being able to say, like, I want to make these 3 requests and then take the response of 2 of them and make a third one based on that and handle errors in this way and retry it with exponential backoff. And
Mm-hmm.
like, there's no other library that can do that in as clean a way. But something I've noticed is that when you then try to take the result of that calculation and say, okay, now we want to render this in the UI somewhere, or maybe in 3 places, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now we have new concerns that we have to deal with. One is that this observable thing is asynchronous. So we have to use async pipe and deal with the fact that like it may not have produced a value yet, so it returns null. That's awkward. You also have the case where if you just naively say like, oh, I'm going to use the async pipe on this observable in 3 places, you get
Mm-hmm.
3 separate subscriptions and
Mm-hmm.
3 separate backend requests, right? So I have to make sure to share replay this thing so that I'm not incurring kind of multiple side effects when I subscribe in my templates. So there's a little bit of friction to using observables to drive data deep inside the templates,
Mm-hmm.
that I think is a natural boundary point for signals. So you do your RxJS stuff, you create your data as an observable, then you convert it to a signal to tell the template about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's kind of like a much more powerful async pipe, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was one thing that I did gather pretty early on, just from the discussions and things, was that this gives you, let's say you're still living in the RxJS world today, and signals are introduced. It actually gives
Mhm.
you like a clearer line of like where all the stuff that you want to do ends, and the stuff that actually tells Angular in the template or even in the component when the framework needs to do something. And I thought that was pretty.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that was intentional, but I also thought I could see where it could clear a lot of things up, because you don't have to create the bridge anymore, like with the async pipe and that sort of thing.
Yeah, just in the chat, I noticed someone asked, like, is there a notion of going from observable to signal? How does that work without a subscribe? It absolutely is a subscription.
Mm-hmm.
Async pipe is also a subscription, right? It's subscribing to the observable under the hood, in order to take its value from that async callback and produce it synchronously for the template to use.
Mm-hmm.
And so the interop from observable to signal works the same way. It's converting the value to a signal, by subscribing and automatically unsubscribing whenever the component or context gets destroyed. And the nice thing about that is it's not trapped in a template. You can take that signal, you can use it
Mm-hmm.
in your template, you can use it in your event listeners, you can pass it around to 5 other components, and it preserves the kind of notifications from the observable. So it will mark all the downstream components where you read it to be checked whenever the observable emits a new event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. That, like I said, that part I thought was really interesting. Like I said, you still got all your magic. Well, I don't want to call it magic. You still got all the things that you want to do, but the part at the template level or component level definitely becomes simplified there. Um, but as far as like the signals themselves, can you like talk about some maybe just cover like a few of like the high level APIs that you talked about, like in the, or there's the stuff in the PR,
Yeah,
And then kind of from the discussion, are there like the at least the primary ways you interact with the with signals today as they're being introduced?
absolutely. Yeah. So Ryan likes to frame kind of the signal concepts around three different terms, right? There's signal, computed, and effect.
Mm-hmm.
And a signal is like a source value. It's something that you can mutate.
Mm-hmm.
So it is. I think of signals as like they're values, but they can also tell you when they change.
Right.
Um, so it in RxJS, it's very similar to a behavior subject, right? Behavior subject also has a .get value,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and you can subscribe to it. And so the way in Angular you create this thing is we have a signal function, and you pass in the value that you want the signal to have to start with, and it returns this signal object.
Mm-hmm.
And the signal object is, in our implementation, it is a getter function.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a function you call with no arguments that returns the current value. And there were a couple of reasons for that. We will go into them in the RFC. But generally, we wanted, like, you need to have some mechanism for automatically tracking subscription, right? So it can't just be a plain, Boolean value or something like that. It has to be, has to have code that runs when you read it. And so using a function call kind of makes it clear that like this is doing something more than just reading the value. This is
Mm-hmm.
actually doing a subscription behind the scenes. But a function call is also like only 2 characters of syntax on top.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fairly lightweight as far as overhead goes and syntactic overhead goes in reading this thing.
Yeah, I was going to say I'll drop a link in the chat here too. But Ania had wrote up a blog post last year sometime that was because I know this has been a thing that has
Yeah.
been long been said as taboo in Angular templates is calling functions. But now that Signals has are introducing signals that, like you said, it's just a getter function, you can still use those getter functions without having to pay any penalty there, right?
Yeah. So, a couple of things on that. One is like the taboo against calling functions and templates. I think is kind of a general rule that people have created that more avoids any possibility of a problem rather than is something that specifically is always a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So function calls in general are fine, right? Even getters and property reads in JavaScript are sometimes function calls.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but when you just call a function and aren't really careful with what you're doing, right? That function might be doing something that's more expensive than just returning a value.
Mm-hmm.
It might be filtering an array, for example. And in a world where you're running change detection and you're continually evaluating this binding to make sure that the value hasn't changed, doing those expensive computations on every cycle does add up. So avoiding a function call in a template was more because it's easy for functions to become expensive, not because they're always expensive.
Right.
And signals are in particular like guaranteed to be cheap to evaluate.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so once you get past this kind of signal concept that you can update, we also have computed properties,
Mm-hmm.
which are ways of saying I want to take the values of one or more other signals and derive some new value from them. So I have the user's first name and the last name, and I want to derive their like full name by concatenating these things together.
Mm-hmm.
Or I have an array of 1,000 to-do objects, right? And I want to filter it by the current search query.
Mm.
Those are examples of computed.
It's time to bring in combine latest now.
Yeah, it is almost combined latest, right? But for the
Mm-hmm.
synchronous world of signals.
Yeah.
And the really interesting thing about this is it's memoized, right? The
Mm-hmm.
computation does not need to run every time you read the value. It only runs when it potentially changes.
Mm-hmm.
When you update the first name, right, then the full name kind of knows that it's invalid and needs to recompute the next time you read it. And so our signals are actually really lazy like that.
Mm.
So if you have first name and last name, and then you have some derived property that's the full name expressed
Mm-hmm.
as a computed, if no one is interested in the full name, right? If no template is actually reading this thing,
Mm-hmm.
and you change the first name, we don't recompute the full name, right? Nothing is interested. Why would we do work that doesn't need to be done? So it's actually really efficient that way. And this
Yeah.
works for inputs as well. So if you have inputs that are signals and you don't use them in your component, in your template, then that template does not need to be checked whenever someone changes the value of one of the inputs.
Ah, right. I see. Yeah, like you mentioned before, it also seems like it gives the framework more like granularity as far as notifications of, like I said, of things that change. We're kind of moving, shifting from the global way of checking everything, whether something has changed or
Yeah.
not, to a point of where, like I said, fine grain reactivity is what you're after, or what the team's after with signals in that way. So
Yeah. When we have information about what's changing and where, right, and when, and what depends on it, then we can be really targeted with the way we update the UI.
mm-hmm.
And so there's frameworks that do this at the component tree level, like React.
Mm-hmm.
There's frameworks that do this at the entire application level, like Angular, right? Change detection runs the whole tree, um, except for on push and other optimizations. There's frameworks like Solid that descend down to like, okay, we're going to update individual bindings or individual elements,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll fall somewhere in the middle there. It's always kind of a trade-off of how much bookkeeping do you do versus how granular you are with your updates. But we think we can find a really efficient kind of middle point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think at least, like I said, it simplifies things from the framework level, but also kind of gives you all more flexibility of, like I said, being more flexibility and being more efficient. I would say about updates, which I've gotten comments before about Angular not being the fast, or as one of the fastest ones out there as far as being able to update changes or
Mm-hmm.
in that way. So maybe we'll get maybe long down the road. I don't know how far. I know this is,
Yeah,
like I said, this is a journey, but this seems like there could be additional optimizations there that could come down further down the road.
and it goes back to Zone.js in a way too. Um, like change detection as one thing that I hear sometimes, that's a little bit of a pet peeve, is when people talk about Angular change detection and use the term re-rendering.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done that in the past too, because it's easy to start thinking that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but change detection is not the same as like the re-execution of a component in React, for example,
Right.
where you're producing new VDOM and then doing a diffing operation. Um, just executing the bindings in a template does not destroy and remove the DOM and recreate it, nor does it actually even update the DOM unless something actually changed.
Mm-hmm.
So change detection is very efficient at determining what needs to update in the UI.
Mm-hmm.
So a really well architected Angular application where someone has kind of cared about the performance um, should not have a problem when it comes to the performance of DOM updates. The
Mm-hmm.
problem is it is kind of too easy to fall off of this happy path.
You mean too
It's
easy to fall off that happy path today?
today, yeah,
Yeah.
with
Okay.
Zone.js, right? It's too
Yeah, I
easy
gotcha.
to like accidentally subscribe to a scroll event or
Oh
run
yeah, yeah,
some
yeah.
content script in the zone and end up in a situation where you have change detection triggering way more than it needs to.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I've said before that in almost every performance problem that I've debugged in an Angular application, the problem has been too much change detection,
Mm-hmm.
not change detection itself, like a single pass running too slowly.
Right. Yeah,
It's
definitely
because it's
agree with
triggered
that.
too much. So when you optimize and say like, oh, we're going to make everything on push to make the app perform better, um, it helps because if you're running change detection too many times, making it smaller does make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it is really not tackling the root cause of the problem.
Right, because I know there have been many blog posts written about on push and you should just turn on push on for everything, and the on push
Yeah,
is the magic bullet that will cure your performance problems. But it's like I
yeah,
said, at the root level, it's more of a band-aid over something that maybe the framework, or that you're looking at making the framework smarter about handling those the change detection itself, as
yeah.
opposed to making it not
More
do it
more
as much.
guardrails, I think, is how I would describe it. Like,
Hmm.
make it harder to fall off the performance good path.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's great because, like I said, that way new developers coming in using Angular will have a better experience because they're not, like I said, they're not falling off that cliff as quickly, or there there there's more things in place that will keep them on the happy path and keep
Yeah.
the applications running faster.
What I hope is that there will just be less to learn, right?
Hmm.
You shouldn't have to learn about the rules of what you can do in ng after viewing it.
Mm.
You shouldn't have to learn about how to properly do set timeout if you want to push data against unidirectional data flow, like
Hmm.
or what the on push restrictions are and all the different gotchas there. One big problem with on push is it makes all of your child components kind of shielded from change detection as well,
Hmm.
which is a problem if they're not written to be compatible with it, right? Not every
Like
component is designed to work.
I'm updating this property. Why am I not seeing anything? Well, you
Exactly.
had on push somewhere up higher, and now this component down here is like out on its own island. It doesn't know what to do.
Yeah. So the idea behind signals is that you just have kind of one principled way of telling the framework that you're changing something.
Hmm.
And that should make the story a lot more consistent across the board.
Yeah, when I was working on the Angular team doing documentation, and we were rewriting the getting started guides at the time, which I think the docs are getting some more love. So I definitely want to give a shout out to the team that's working on the docs now and trying to improve those. But the thing that always kind of came out was that we're trying to decrease the number of things that a new developer has to learn when they pick up Angular. And it seems like we're progressively, I don't want to call it shaving off those things, but
Yeah.
there's like, well, there's ng modules. It's like, well, we don't want them to have, and we were trying to do this. We were trying to do this in the tutorial where we were trying to only introduce those things like at the moment that you needed them. And like ng modules was one. It was like, well, we don't want people to have to learn RxJS to go through the tutorial. We just want them to learn Angular. And it seems like Signals is like another step in that path of you can pick up an Angular app, you can write a component, it's like Zone.js is not a thing that you have to teach a new Angular developer that they're going to run into eventually because there's something there for them to use like right up front.
Yeah. I think even more painful than things you have to learn, right? Concepts you have to learn up front are concepts that you have to unlearn,
Mm.
right? Where you learn some way of doing things and getting started, and then later on, down the road in your career as a developer, it's like, oh no, actually, like, you get to a point where that's not the way to do things, and you have to go
Mm-hmm.
back and learn something new, like on push. I think is a good example there.
Mm-hmm.
So having a unified concept for how you update components, I think, is really powerful in that sense. It gets rid of a lot of those further steps. One of the things we were looking at with signals, or as an alternative to signals, right, is doing something in the compiler.
Mm-hmm.
So having state that's like annotated in a component somewhere and generating the reactivity automatically. And the thing that really bothered us about that is that experience is great until you go to refactor your state up to somewhere else in the application. Like, oh, I need
Mm-hmm.
3 components to share this thing, so I need to pull it out and put it in the service. And at that point, you have to kind of switch paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take it into a store or something like that, where you're manipulating or treating the state in a different way. One of the properties that I love about the signals design, one of the big kind of check marks for it, for us, was what Pavel calls like complete freedom of refactoring.
Mm.
Literally, you can take signal code in a component and copy paste it into a service, and it will
Mm-hmm.
still work, and the reactivity will still flow through to the components that depend on it.
Mm-hmm.
You have
Yeah.
one shared paradigm that works across the whole application.
Mm-hmm. That was one of the early questions I know when they're talking about signals was, does this have to live in the component?
Yep.
And the and the answer was no, and it was like, shoo. one,
Yeah.
one of those things. So definitely was a good thing that was, like I said, thought out in advance of this is something that you can, like I said, easily refactor to kind of hoist it up out of the a single component itself
So
for other
I
components to use.
I want to go back to one of the very early questions.
Yeah, sure.
Someone asked, like, will the compiler, compile signals or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and we were just talking a little bit about like compiler-based reactivity versus not. Um, there are some really cool things that we think we'll be able to do with the compiler.
Mm.
So one thing that a lot of people don't think too much about in applications, because it's a little bit subtle, a little bit advanced, right, is if you have cases where you have UI components that need to do DOM manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes in material, you have components that need to measure their size on the page because they want to calculate some ripple effect or something that's um, based on the current position. Sometimes you want to update the DOM. Sometimes you want to open a modal by like moving this thing into a particular location.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and if you do these things in the wrong order, they will still work, but you'll end up causing reflows in the browser
Mm-hmm.
where you read from the DOM, you get this value, and then that triggers the browser to say, okay, now I have to lay out the whole page because you asked me where this element was. And then you say, oh, sorry, browser, I'm gonna remove this thing and put it over here. And the browser goes, oh, I gotta like throw away all the layout I just did, right, and redo the whole thing. Um, and
The browser's getting pretty salty with all the work that you're telling.
yeah, basically, right. And you notice this, it creates long tasks, and you see these sections of purple in the performance in Chrome. Um, one interesting thing we can do with the compiler is say, hey, if you have signal effects that you're doing where you are reading from the DOM, and we know you're reading from the DOM because we can see you're calling get computed style,
Mm-hmm.
and you have signal effects that you're doing where you're mutating the DOM, we can, in our compiler, add the right hints to the runtime to say, hey, when you run these things, try and get them in this order, where you're not affecting the correctness of this application, but you're just optimizing it that little bit extra to avoid doing reflows, right? Let's maybe do the write before the read so the browser only has to reflow once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that that I think that would be a welcome optimization also. Like I said, it opens up a lot of things, some things that we don't have to think about that like I said, the compiler can take care of for us, which would be great. Um, there was a question in the chat because I think it's an important one. Are signals going to be a breaking change in Angular? Well, I I kind of know the answer to this, but are signals going to be a breaking change given the world that we live in today?
Yeah, excellent question. Um, you'll absolutely have to do work to get benefits from signals, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you want to use signals in a component, it takes refactoring your state into being able to tell the framework when and where it changes to do that. Signals will be completely interoperable with
Mm-hmm.
the Zone.js world of Angular today, right? So if you want to use signals in one component, but use that in an application that's still using zones, that's completely fine.
Mm-hmm.
There's an interoperability model there for how their inputs flow from one to the other. Um, so in that sense, no, it's not going to be a breaking change. If you want the full benefit of going zoneless, right, then you will have to invest in kind of porting all of your components over from zones to signals.
Right. And I will drop another link in the chat here. It's just going to be to the README in the PR that I think is out there that for the initial implementation of Signal. So if you want to take a further look at what Signals means, definitely take a look at that. And if you're interested in digging into the PR, that PR is there also, which I'll add that to the notes for the show anyway, so people can go back and look in the code and look through the docs and everything. But yes, I was gonna say I already had a hint of what the answer was because I'm gonna call it the Angular way. Is that even when we introduce new features that they don't break
Yeah.
the existing world for people out there, or because you have a lot
And
of apps inside Google and outside of Google.
yeah, I was just going to say we have, thousands of Angular applications inside of Google. Some of them are, of the millions or tens of millions of lines of code, um, size scale. They are
Mm-hmm.
not removing Zone.js anytime now or the next like 5 years, right?
I said the
So
same thing. I worked on
yeah,
some large apps, and I was like, no way they were
yeah,
they're gonna. I was like, they would have to basically like rewrite the app from scratch as opposed to trying to move off of Zone.js, unless there was some magic button they could press
yeah.
and
And
do it. But yeah.
like with standalone, there may be cases where we can have schematics that help you, that do some of the more mechanical work of migration, and then kind of give you the output code and say like, hey, is this right? Can you test this and make sure it works? Or leave to do comments like I couldn't figure out this part. But there may be, it may not be entirely 100% like on your effort to migrate something. We
Hmm.
should at least be able to help with some of the more syntactical and structural things.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Cool. So I won't hold you too much longer, but the I did want to say the like I said the PR is out there. You landed an early PR, and you said that an
Mhm.
RFC will come, and you said that you wanted to get some early feedback for like internally and externally from people who are interested in where Angular is going in that way. So what other things? How else can the community help along with this journey of signals and the process that you lined out in the discussion there?
The most amazing thing for me would be if people will play with this concept.
Hmm.
We will have, like, we do next releases of Angular, so Angular 16 will have a next release before it has an RC and a final.
Hmm.
And you should be able to experiment with the experience there. The best case scenario, in my opinion, is if when we release the RFC, that people have kind of built up familiarity with some of the basic concepts.
Hmm.
Um, can be that much more help in giving feedback on the overall design.
Yeah, I think that I think it was good that you, like you said, you took an earlier approach this time. I don't know, it's like a pre RFC where you get a lot of
Yeah,
the comments of why and what are we doing this, and then people have a kind of people can take a step back and kind of look at the landscape of things, and then when the actual RFC comes out, they're like, oh, I have an understanding of where this is going. Maybe we'll
yeah.
get some more concrete feedback and maybe a little less noise.
This is a very big change, right? And I think it would have been kind of unfair to drop a huge RFC on the community without any pre-announcement and say like, "Oh, surprise signals!" Like,
Surprise signals. Here's the PR and all the
yeah,
things. You're welcome.
yeah,
We're going on vacation.
yeah. And we want to make sure we have the right amount of time to actually react to feedback too, and
Hmm.
make changes in the design if we need. We did that with standalone. We did that with type forms, and I think we're very much willing to hear community feedback and incorporate that into our design decisions.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, with that, I think we could probably wrap up there. If you unless you saw any questions there that seemed interesting to answer.
I see.
am going to drop some links in the chat here. But yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I see a lot of interesting questions. I think there's a lot of stuff to talk about in the RFC.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Cool. Yeah, I'm going to drop a link to the discussion in the chat here. Also, going to drop a link to your handle on Twitter. Um,
absolutely.
so, everybody who's in the chat, feel free to follow Alex there. I am going to drop Pavel's Twitter link in the chat also because he has been a champion of the signals, the signal. I call it the signal train. He's been on the signal train for a while also. Definitely, if you're not following him already, follow him, and like I said, keep up with the the look out for the RFC that'll be coming at some point in the future. Get your thoughts together. Enia posted a link in the chat that you can play around with the Stack Blitz that he's already put together. So you're welcome on that front. But yeah, thanks for coming on. Like I said, y'all just like publicly announced something this yesterday, and I said I was going to do a live stream about it today. Either way, and you were gracious enough to come on and have a discussion about it, which I think was pretty cool. So appreciate you
Absolutely.
for that.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, sure. But yeah, everyone, with that, thanks for coming out, and we'll see y'all in the next one.